What if I told you that America has nearly collapsed at least 10 different times, and most people have no idea how close we came to not existing as a country? We're not talking about theoretical dangers or exaggerated threats. We're talking about moments when banks literally stopped functioning, when states aimed cannons at federal troops, when nuclear missiles sat 90 miles from Florida with launch codes ready, when the entire financial system was 48 hours from complete shutdown. Over the next couple of hours, we're going to walk through 10 verified moments when the United States came terrifyingly close to fracturing, failing, or simply ceasing to exist. These aren't distant colonial struggles. These are constitutional crises, economic collapses, military standoffs, and institutional failures that tested whether democracy could actually survive contact with reality. So if you're enjoying this deep dive into the moments that almost ended America, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Get comfortable, maybe grab some water, and let's talk about the times when everything nearly fell apart and somehow improbably didn't. Starting with the moment when the entire banking system collapsed and people were literally burying cash in their backyards because they didn't trust any institution to survive the week. The Great Depression, 1930-1933. So here's the thing about America in 1929. Everything seemed fine. The stock market was doing that thing where numbers only go up, which, as we all know from basic pattern recognition, is definitely sustainable forever. People were buying stocks with borrowed money, banks were lending to anyone with a pulse, and the general vibe was something like a party where everyone's had 3 drinks too many, but nobody wants to be the one to suggest going home. And then October came around. You've probably heard about Black Tuesday, October 29th, 1929, when the stock market didn't just decline, it essentially fell off a cliff while screaming. But here's what your high school textbook maybe didn't emphasize enough. That crash wasn't actually the worst part. The crash was more like the opening credits. The real horror show was what happened over the next 3.5 years, which was essentially watching the entire economic system slowly realize it had no idea what it was doing. Picture this. By 1933, roughly 13 million Americans were unemployed. That's about 1 in 4 people who wanted to work. Banks were failing at a rate that would make your head spin. Over 9,000 banks collapsed between 1930 and 1933. 9,000. That's not a typo. When your bank fails, by the way, that doesn't mean you get a polite letter apologizing for the inconvenience. It means your life savings just evaporated like morning fog, except fog eventually comes back. People were standing in bread lines that stretched around city blocks. Families were living in shanty towns made of scrap metal and cardboard, which they called Hoovervilles, named after President Herbert Hoover, because when you're that angry and that hungry, you get creative with your civic criticism. These weren't small tent cities either. There was one in St. Louis that housed over 1,000 people. In Manhattan, one stretched along the Hudson River in Riverside Park. Imagine looking at the New York City skyline from a shelter made of tin cans and old newspapers. The really terrifying part wasn't just the economic numbers, though those were catastrophic enough. It was the philosophical crisis happening underneath everything. Democracy and capitalism were supposed to be this winning combination, right? The American system, the thing that made sense. Except now, it very clearly didn't make sense, and people were starting to wonder if maybe some other system might work better. Communist and fascist movements started gaining traction, which should tell you how desperate things had gotten. When your economy collapses so thoroughly that actual fascism starts sounding reasonable to some people, you've crossed a line from crisis into existential threat. Herbert Hoover, to his credit, wasn't just sitting around doing nothing. He tried. He really did. He established the Reconstruction Finance Corporation to loan money to banks and businesses. He supported some public works projects. But Hoover had this deeply held belief that the federal government shouldn't directly intervene too much in the economy, that private charity and local communities should handle relief efforts, which is a fine philosophy right up until the moment when private charity runs out of money and local communities are also completely broke. The problem was scale. This wasn't a local disaster. This wasn't even a national disaster in the traditional sense. This was the entire economic foundation of the country crumbling, and trying to fix it with private charity was like trying to bail out the Titanic with a teaspoon. Well intentioned, perhaps. Profoundly insufficient. Definitely. By the election of 1932, the American public was ready for literally anything different. Enter Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a man who'd already survived polio and was apparently ready to take on an economic apocalypse as his next challenge. FDR won that election in a landslide, which makes sense because Hoover's campaign slogan might as well have been more of the same catastrophic failure. Roosevelt took office on March 4th, 1933. By that point, the banking system was in complete freefall. People were hoarding cash because they didn't trust banks anymore, which created a self-fulfilling prophecy where banks couldn't function because everyone had withdrawn their money because they thought banks couldn't function. It's the economic equivalent of a snake eating its own tail, except less mythologically interesting and more concretely devastating. FDR's first move was almost comically direct. On March 6th, 2 days after taking office, he declared a national bank holiday, which sounds lovely until you realize it meant closing every bank in the country. Just shut them all down. The entire banking system closed. It's the kind of move that either saves a nation or destroys it, with very little middle ground. Here's what happened during that bank holiday. The Treasury Department, working basically around the clock, examined the books of every bank in America. They separated banks into 3 categories: sound banks that could reopen immediately, banks that needed help but were salvageable, and banks that were basically economic zombies that needed to stay closed permanently. Then, and this is the clever part, they only let the sound banks reopen. On March 12th, 1933, banks started opening again, but not all of them. Only the ones that had been certified as stable. And because the government had done this very public examination and certification process, people actually trusted these banks again. Deposits started flowing back in instead of out. The death spiral stopped. But Roosevelt didn't stop there because stopping a panic is different from fixing a system. The Emergency Banking Act gave the government the power to reorganize and reopen banks. The Glass-Steagall Act separated commercial banking from investment banking, so your regular savings account wasn't being gambled on the stock market. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation was created, which meant even if a bank did fail, your deposits were insured by the federal government up to a certain amount. Suddenly, putting your money in a bank wasn't an act of pure faith. It was actually reasonably safe. The New Deal programs that followed were this sprawling collection of agencies and initiatives with alphabet soup names: the CCC, the WPA, the TVA, the SEC. Some of them worked brilliantly. Some of them were administrative disasters. But collectively, they signaled that the federal government wasn't going to just let the economy eat itself alive. They put people to work building roads, bridges, schools, parks. They brought electricity to rural areas that private companies had decided weren't profitable enough to bother with. They created a social safety net that hadn't really existed before. Was all of this constitutionally questionable? Absolutely. The Supreme Court struck down several New Deal programs. Did it work? Also, yes. Between 1933 and 1937, the economy grew at an average annual rate of over 9%. Unemployment dropped from 25% to 14%, which is still terrible but considerably less apocalyptic. The thing that saved America during the Great Depression wasn't just the specific policies, though those mattered. It was the restoration of faith that the system could actually respond to crisis, that democracy could adapt, that when things got historically bad, the government could act decisively instead of just wringing its hands and hoping private charity would somehow solve a systemic collapse. Of course, this created its own tensions. Plenty of people thought Roosevelt was becoming a dictator, that the New Deal was socialism or communism or whatever. Ism scared them most, and those weren't entirely unreasonable fears. When you give the government enormous emergency powers, you're making a bet that those powers will be used responsibly and then relinquished when the crisis passes. It's a dangerous bet. But the alternative, watching democracy collapse because it couldn't respond to crisis, was arguably more dangerous. The Great Depression tested whether American democracy was resilient enough to survive economic catastrophe. The answer turned out to be yes, but only barely. And only because people were willing to try things that seemed radical or impossible or constitutionally dubious, the system bent far enough that it didn't break, which is about as much as you can ask from any human institution, really. And speaking of systems being tested to their absolute limits by their own structural weaknesses, let's talk about what happened when America tried to run itself without a functioning federal government. The Articles of Confederation Crisis, 1780s. Okay, so imagine you've just fought an 8-year war to free yourself from what you considered an oppressive central government. You've won somehow, despite being outgunned and outfunded and generally out everythinged. You're exhausted, you're broke, and you're deeply suspicious of anyone who wants to tell you what to do. What's your next move? If you're the newly independent American states in 1783, your answer is apparently to create a federal government so weak it can barely send a letter without asking permission from 13 different state legislatures. This seemed like a good idea at the time, which should tell you something about how much people distrusted centralized authority after dealing with King George III. The Articles of Confederation were ratified in 1781, and they were basically designed to make sure the federal government couldn't oppress anyone, mainly by making sure it couldn't really do anything at all. The Continental Congress could declare war, but it couldn't force states to provide troops. It could sign treaties, but it couldn't enforce them. It could request money from the states, but it couldn't tax anyone directly. It was like being given a car with no engine and being told to drive across the country. Technically, you have a vehicle. Functionally, you're walking. Here's where it gets interesting. Each state acted basically like its own country. They printed their own money, which meant traveling from Virginia to New York required a currency exchange like you were crossing international borders. States taxed goods from other states, creating trade barriers within the same supposed nation. New York taxed firewood from Connecticut and cabbage from New Jersey, because apparently that's what you do when you want to annoy your neighbors with maximum efficiency. The federal government, such as it was, couldn't regulate any of this. It couldn't force states to stop economically attacking each other. It couldn't create a common currency. It couldn't enforce the treaties it had signed with foreign nations, which made those foreign nations understandably skeptical about making deals with America. Britain kept military posts in the Northwest Territory in violation of the Treaty of Paris, and Congress could send strongly worded letters about it, which is exactly as effective as it sounds. But the real crisis was financial. The Revolutionary War had been expensive, shockingly so. The government had borrowed money from France, Spain, the Netherlands, and individual Americans. It had issued bonds and made promises. And now all those debts were coming due, except the government had no way to pay them because it couldn't tax anyone. Individual states had their own debt problems too. Massachusetts was particularly aggressive about collecting taxes to pay off its war debts, which brings us to one of the more illuminating moments in early American history. Farmers in western Massachusetts were being crushed by these taxes, Many of them were Revolutionary War veterans who'd been paid in basically worthless paper currency and were now being told to pay hard currency taxes. When they couldn't pay, the courts foreclosed on their farms and sometimes threw them in debtor's prison, which must have felt particularly insulting after you've just fought a war supposedly about freedom. These farmers tried to petition the state government for relief. They asked for tax delays, for the right to pay in goods instead of currency, for the courts to stop the constant foreclosures. The state government, controlled by Eastern merchants and creditors, essentially said no to everything, which led to Shays' Rebellion in 1786, but we'll get to that specific disaster in detail later. For now, just know that armed farmers shutting down courts was a symptom of how badly the system was failing. The economic chaos wasn't just theoretical. Soldiers from the Revolutionary War weren't being paid their back wages. Some of them had been fighting since 1775 and were owed years of salary. The government kept promising to pay them eventually, which is not a great message to send to people who've been shot at on your behalf. In 1783, there was a genuine fear of a military coup when officers gathered in Newburgh, New York, to discuss forcing Congress to pay them. George Washington personally intervened to shut that down, giving a speech where he literally put on reading glasses and said, "Gentlemen, you will permit me to put on my spectacles, for I have not only grown gray, but almost blind in the service of my country," which is a devastating guilt trip, even by 18th century standards. Foreign nations looked at America and saw chaos. They saw states fighting each other economically, a federal government that couldn't enforce its own treaties, debts going unpaid, and domestic rebellions. Spain closed the Mississippi River to American trade, knowing Congress couldn't do anything about it. Britain didn't bother evacuating its military posts because why would they? Who was going to make them? Some states started making their own foreign policy. Individual states tried to negotiate separate agreements with Native American tribes and foreign powers, which is not how you run a coherent nation. It's how you run 13 small countries pretending to be one big one. Trade was a nightmare. Congress couldn't regulate interstate or foreign commerce, so states made their own deals and their own rules. This created a situation where merchants never quite knew what regulations or tariffs they'd face, which made long-term economic planning essentially impossible. Some states had hard currency requirements, others accepted paper money of dubious value, and the whole thing was an economic disaster that benefited basically no one except maybe the currency speculators. By 1786, serious people were seriously worried that the American experiment was failing. The Articles of Confederation had created a government so limited that it couldn't actually govern. States were fragmenting into regional interests. There was genuine discussion about whether America should split into 3 separate confederacies, North, Middle, and South, because at least then each region could create a government that actually functioned. George Washington, watching all this from Mount Vernon, became increasingly alarmed. He'd fought for 8 years to create an independent nation, and now that nation was falling apart from sheer governmental incompetence. He started corresponding with other leaders about the need for a stronger federal system. James Madison was writing essays about the structural failures of confederacies throughout history. Alexander Hamilton was probably stress writing financial treatises at 3 a.m, as was his way. The crisis came to a head when a convention was called in Annapolis in 1786 to discuss interstate trade issues. Only 5 states showed up, which tells you how seriously some states took federal coordination. But the delegates who did attend, led by Hamilton and Madison, decided that trying to fix trade issues without addressing the fundamental governmental structure was pointless. They called for a broader convention to be held in Philadelphia in 1787 to revise the Articles of Confederation. That Philadelphia Convention, of course, ended up doing considerably more than revision. They threw out the Articles entirely and wrote the Constitution, creating a federal government with actual power to tax, regulate commerce, and enforce laws. It was a gamble. Many people feared they were creating exactly the kind of centralized tyranny they just fought a war to escape. The ratification debates were fierce, and it took until 1788 for enough states to ratify the new Constitution for it to take effect. What saved America during the Articles of Confederation crisis wasn't military force or economic miracle. It was a group of leaders willing to admit that their first attempt at government had failed and willing to try something radically different despite the risks. They created a system with more federal power, but also with checks and balances designed to prevent that power from becoming tyrannical. Whether they succeeded is still being debated, but at least they created a government that could actually function as a government. The whole episode is a reminder that even the founding fathers didn't get it right the first time. They tried a system, watched it fail spectacularly, and were pragmatic enough to start over, which is either reassuring or terrifying, depending on your mood. And if you think economic collapse and governmental dysfunction is stressful, just wait until we talk about the time two nuclear-armed superpowers played chicken with the entire planet's survival. The Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962. Let's talk about October 1962, which was 13 days when humanity came closer to ending itself than at any other point in history. And most people didn't even know it was happening until it was almost over. Which is maybe the most terrifying part. The world nearly ended while you were eating breakfast and reading the morning paper, completely unaware that somewhere, very serious men were calculating nuclear blast radiuses and trying not to panic. Here's how close we're talking. At one point during the crisis, American destroyers were dropping practice depth charges on a Soviet submarine to force it to surface. The submarine had been out of contact with Moscow for days. The captain didn't know if World War III had already started. The submarine was equipped with a nuclear torpedo. Soviet protocol required agreement from 3 officers to launch a nuclear weapon. 2 of them, the captain and the political officer, wanted to launch. The 3rd officer, a man named Vasily Arkhipov, said no. One person, one decision. Between the world you live in and a different timeline where nuclear war started in the Caribbean in October 1962. But let's back up, because the crisis didn't just materialize out of nowhere. It was the result of years of Cold War tension, proxy wars, failed invasions, and the kind of geopolitical chess that makes regular chess look simple and relaxing. The background goes like this. In 1959, Fidel Castro led a revolution in Cuba that overthrew the US-backed dictator Fulgencio Batista. The US was not thrilled about having a communist government 90 miles from Florida, which is roughly the distance between Miami and Havana, close enough that on a clear day, you can almost see Cuba from Key West. The Eisenhower administration started planning ways to get rid of Castro. When Kennedy took office in 1961, he inherited these plans. In April 1961 came the Bay of Pigs invasion, which was possibly one of the most spectacular failures in CIA history, and that's a competitive category. The plan was to land Cuban exiles in Cuba who would spark a popular uprising against Castro. Except there was no popular uprising. The exiles were quickly defeated, and the whole thing made America look simultaneously aggressive and incompetent, which is not an easy combination to achieve. Castro understandably felt like the Americans were trying to kill him, which they were. The CIA had multiple plots to assassinate Castro, including schemes involving exploding cigars and poison milkshakes, because apparently someone thought cartoon assassination methods would work in real life. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union, led by Nikita Khrushchev, saw an opportunity. If America was going to be hostile to Cuba, Cuba would need protection. Soviet protection. By the summer of 1962, the Soviets started secretly shipping nuclear missiles to Cuba. Not just any missiles, medium-range and intermediate-range ballistic missiles that could hit most of the eastern United States in minutes. Washington, New York, Chicago, all within range. The missiles could deliver nuclear warheads with a combined destructive power that would make Hiroshima look like a firecracker. The Soviets were good at keeping this quiet. They shipped the missiles in the holds of cargo ships, disguised the launch sites to look like agricultural facilities from the air, and explicitly lied to American officials about what they were doing. In September, Khrushchev publicly stated that the USSR had no need to place nuclear weapons outside Soviet territory, which was a lie, and Khrushchev knew it was a lie, and he was betting that Kennedy wouldn't find out until it was too late to do anything about it. But on October 14, 1962, an American U-2 spy plane flying over western Cuba took photographs of what were very clearly medium-range ballistic missile sites under construction. The photos landed on Kennedy's desk on October 16th, and suddenly the president had a problem with no good solutions. Think about the options. Option 1, do nothing. Except that the Soviets now have nuclear missiles in Cuba. This was politically impossible. Kennedy had publicly warned the Soviets not to place offensive weapons in Cuba. Backing down would make him look weak, embolden the Soviets, and potentially get him destroyed in the upcoming midterm elections. Also, having nuclear missiles 90 miles from Florida actually was a legitimate security threat. Option 2, invade Cuba. Send in troops, take out the missile sites by force. Except this would definitely kill Soviet soldiers, which would force Khrushchev to respond, which could easily spiral into World War III. Also, the missiles might already be operational, meaning an invasion could trigger a nuclear response. You'd be trading a potential future threat for a definite, immediate nuclear exchange. Option 3, airstrikes. Bomb the missile sites before they become operational. This was the military's preferred option, but it had the same escalation problems as an invasion. Plus, the Air Force couldn't guarantee they'd destroy all the missiles in the first strike, and the ones you missed would presumably be launched at American cities. Option 4, blockade. Stop Soviet ships from bringing more missiles to Cuba and negotiate for the removal of the missiles already there. This was less immediately aggressive than bombing or invasion, but it was still an act of war under international law. The Navy preferred calling it a quarantine instead of a blockade, because that sounded slightly less warlike, which is the kind of semantic distinction you worry about when you're trying not to start nuclear war. Kennedy assembled a group called ExComm, the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, to advise him. They met constantly, often in secret, debating every option. The Joint Chiefs of Staff pushed for airstrikes. The Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, leaned toward the blockade. Kennedy's brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, was in most of the meetings, asking difficult questions and pushing people to think through the consequences of their recommendations. The debate was intense. Some advisors genuinely believed war was inevitable and wanted to strike first while they had the advantage. Others thought any military action would lead to catastrophe. They ran war games and scenarios. Every scenario that started with military action ended with escalation to general nuclear war. The casualty estimates were apocalyptic. Tens of millions dead in the first exchanges, more from fallout and societal collapse. On October 22nd, Kennedy went on television and told the American public what was happening. He announced the quarantine and demanded that the Soviets remove the missiles. The speech was calm but firm, and if you watch it now, knowing what was at stake, it's chilling. He's telling Americans that nuclear missiles are aimed at their cities, and he's trying to sound reassuring while essentially saying the next few days would determine whether civilization survived. The Soviets responded by continuing to work on the missile sites and sending ships toward the quarantine line. The American military went to DEFCON 2, the highest alert level ever reached during the Cold War. B-52 bombers loaded with nuclear weapons began continuous airborne patrols. Missiles in the US and Europe were prepared for launch. Submarines with nuclear weapons moved into position. Both sides were mobilizing for nuclear war while simultaneously trying to negotiate a way out of it. On October 24th, Soviet ships approached the quarantine line. American ships moved to intercept them. This was the moment. Would the Soviets stop, or would they challenge the blockade and force a confrontation? At the United Nations, American Ambassador Adlai Stevenson presented the spy plane photos as evidence in one of the most dramatic UN Security Council sessions in history. The Soviet ambassador denied everything. Stevenson famously said he was prepared to wait until hell freezes over for an answer. The Soviet ships stopped. They didn't turn back immediately, but they stopped short of the quarantine line. Secretary of State Dean Rusk said, "We're eyeball to eyeball," and I think the other fellow just blinked. Which was a relief, except the missiles already in Cuba were still there, still being made operational, and the crisis was far from over. The negotiations got complicated. Khrushchev sent a long emotional letter on October 26th, suggesting he'd remove the missiles if the U.S. pledged not to invade Cuba. Then he sent another letter on October 27th, demanding that the U.S. also remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey. These were American nuclear missiles aimed at the Soviet Union, and from the Soviet perspective, removing them was a reasonable quid pro quo. From the American perspective, publicly trading missiles would look like weakness. October 27th was probably the single most dangerous day. A U-2 spy plane was shot down over Cuba, killing the pilot. The military pressure on Kennedy to retaliate was enormous. At the same time, the incident with the Soviet submarine was happening, the one where Vasily Arkhipov stopped the launch of a nuclear torpedo. American forces were making mistakes too. Another U-2 accidentally flew into Soviet airspace over Siberia, nearly causing a different kind of incident. Kennedy and his advisors decided to accept the first letter and ignore the second. Robert Kennedy met secretly with Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin and said the U.S. would remove the Jupiter missiles from Turkey, but only if this remained secret and only after the Cuban missiles were removed. It was a face-saving compromise that gave both sides what they needed, while allowing both to claim they hadn't backed down. On October 28th, Khrushchev announced that the missiles would be removed from Cuba. Kennedy had agreed not to invade Cuba and, secretly, to remove the missiles from Turkey. The crisis was over. Humanity had stepped back from the edge. The aftermath revealed just how close things had been. Both sides had miscalculated. Kennedy didn't know that Soviet forces in Cuba already had tactical nuclear weapons that could be used against an invasion. Khrushchev didn't realize how much domestic political pressure Kennedy was under. Field commanders on both sides had more authority to use nuclear weapons than anyone in Washington or Moscow realized. There were multiple moments when a single mistake, a miscommunication, or a more aggressive personality in a key position could have started a war. What saved America and the world during the Cuban Missile Crisis was ultimately restraint and communication. Kennedy resisted pressure from his military advisors to strike immediately. Khrushchev pulled back from brinksmanship when he realized how serious the situation was. Both leaders used back-channel communications to negotiate honestly while maintaining public positions. They chose compromise over pride, survival over victory. The crisis led to important changes. A direct hotline was established between Washington and Moscow, so leaders could communicate quickly during crises. Both sides became more careful about nuclear brinksmanship. The Limited Test Ban Treaty was signed the following year. People had looked into the abyss and decided they didn't like what they saw. But it was close, terrifyingly close. Closer than most people realized at the time, and maybe closer than we're entirely comfortable acknowledging even now. And if you think the threat of nuclear annihilation required sophisticated Cold War tensions, let me tell you about the time American farmers with pitchforks nearly overthrew their state government and convinced everyone that the whole democratic experiment might have been a mistake. Shays Rebellion, 1786, 1787. All right, so remember how we just talked about the Articles of Confederation creating a government so weak it could barely function. Well, Shays' rebellion is what happens when that weakness collides with economic hardship, angry veterans, and the revelation that maybe the people who just fought a revolution against unfair taxation have some strong feelings about unfair taxation. The setting is Massachusetts, 1786. The Revolutionary War has been over for 3 years. The economy is a disaster. The state government, trying to pay off its massive war debts, has instituted aggressive tax policies that are crushing rural farmers. We're talking property taxes, poll taxes, taxes on basically everything. And these taxes had to be paid in hard currency, gold or silver, which almost nobody in rural Massachusetts actually had. See, most farmers operated on credit and barter. They'd grow crops, trade with their neighbors, maybe sell some surplus for cash when they could. But the state wanted tax payments in specie, actual metallic money. If you didn't have it, the courts would come after you. They'd seize your property, sell it to pay your debts and taxes, and if that wasn't enough, you could go to debtor's prison, which is exactly as awful as it sounds. Debtor's prison, by the way, is one of those historical concepts that seems designed to maximize human suffering while solving absolutely nothing. You owe money, so we'll lock you in prison where you definitely can't earn money to pay your debts. It's like trying to cure a headache by hitting yourself in the head with a hammer. Effective at making the situation worse, less effective at anything constructive. Many of the farmers being hit by these policies were Revolutionary War veterans, men who'd fought for American independence, often for years, and had been paid in continental currency that was now essentially worthless. There's a special kind of bitter irony in fighting a war against what you consider unfair British taxation, winning, and then being bankrupted by American taxation 3 years later. These farmers tried the legal route first. They petitioned the state legislature for relief. They asked for the right to pay taxes in goods instead of hard currency. They requested delays in debt collection. They wanted the courts to ease up on foreclosures. The Massachusetts legislature, controlled largely by Eastern merchants and creditors who were owed money, said no to basically everything. So, in August 1786, armed farmers started shutting down courts. Not just protesting outside them, actually preventing them from operating. In Northampton, a group of farmers surrounded the courthouse and wouldn't let judges enter. In Worcester, they did the same thing. In Concord, site of one of the first battles of the Revolution, farmers with muskets closed the courthouse to prevent debt hearings. The leader, or at least the most prominent figure, of this movement was Daniel Shays. Shays was a veteran who'd fought at Bunker Hill, Lexington, and Saratoga. He'd been a captain in the Continental Army. He was exactly the kind of person the revolution was supposed to have been fought for. And now he was leading an armed rebellion against his own state government. The state government's response was to call out the militia, which created an immediate problem. The militia was made up largely of the same kind of farmers who were doing the rebelling. When the government tried to call up militia units to suppress the rebellion, many of those units either refused to serve or, in some cases, joined the rebels. It's hard to get people to shoot their neighbors over tax policy, especially when those neighbors have legitimate grievances. By January 1787, Shays and his followers were getting more ambitious. They decided to march on the federal arsenal in Springfield, which contained thousands of muskets and other weapons. If they could seize the arsenal, they'd be a genuine military force instead of just angry farmers with whatever weapons they'd kept from the war. The arsenal was defended by a small force under General William Shepherd. On January 25th, about 1,500 of Shays' followers marched on the arsenal. Shepherd's men fired warning shots over their heads. The rebels kept coming. Shepherd ordered his artillery to fire directly into the advancing farmers. 4 men were killed, 20 were wounded, the rest scattered. It was the first time Americans had fired artillery at other Americans since the Revolution, and it was a shock to everyone involved. This wasn't just protest anymore. This was actual armed conflict between American citizens. The state government, now thoroughly alarmed, raised a private army. Private because the state didn't trust the militia, and the federal government, under the Articles of Confederation, couldn't help. They got funding from wealthy merchants in Boston who were terrified that the rebellion would spread. General Benjamin Lincoln led this force west to crush the rebellion. Shays and his remaining followers retreated north into the winter countryside. Lincoln's army pursued them. On February 4th, 1787, Lincoln's forces caught up with the rebels in Petersham. It wasn't much of a battle. The rebels were exhausted, cold, and demoralized after the deaths at Springfield. Many surrendered, others fled. Shays himself escaped to Vermont. By late February, the rebellion was effectively over. The state eventually pardoned most of the rebels, including Shays. A few leaders were sentenced to death, but those sentences were commuted. The legislature even passed some modest reforms addressing the farmers' economic grievances, which they probably should have done in the first place. But the real impact of Shays' rebellion wasn't in Massachusetts. It was in how the rebellion terrified political leaders across all the states. Here was proof that the Articles of Confederation government was too weak to maintain order. If a state government couldn't even rely on federal support to put down a domestic rebellion, what was the point of having a federal government at all? George Washington, watching from Mount Vernon, was deeply disturbed. He'd spent years fighting to create an independent America, and now it looked like that America might tear itself apart. He wrote letters expressing alarm that the country was approaching anarchy. "I am mortified beyond expression," he wrote, "that the American people were exhibiting such conduct to the annoyance of everybody." The rebellion gave urgency to the movement for a stronger federal government. When delegates gathered in Philadelphia in May 1787 for the Constitutional Convention, Shays' rebellion was fresh in everyone's mind. It was used as evidence that the country needed a government capable of maintaining order, collecting taxes, and responding to crises without having to rely on private armies funded by nervous merchants. The Federalists, arguing for ratification of the new Constitution, pointed to Shays' rebellion as proof of what happens when government is too weak. The Anti-Federalists, opposing ratification, pointed to the rebellion as proof that ordinary people would resist government tyranny, and therefore strong federal power was dangerous. Same event and completely opposite conclusions, which is very on-brand for American political debate. What saved America during Shays' rebellion wasn't overwhelming military force, though force was used. It wasn't dramatic political leadership, though leaders certainly paid attention. What saved America was that the rebellion, despite its violence, remained limited in scope. It didn't spread beyond Massachusetts. Most Americans, even those sympathetic to the farmers' grievances, weren't ready to overthrow their state governments. The rebellion scared leaders badly enough to fix the structural problems with the Articles of Confederation, but not so badly that they abandoned democracy entirely. There's something almost perfectly balanced about it. The rebellion was serious enough to demonstrate that the existing system was broken, but contained enough that there was time to fix it through political means rather than military ones. If the rebellion had been smaller and less violent, maybe the Articles of Confederation would have limped along for years. If it had been larger and more widespread, maybe the response would have been authoritarian crackdown rather than constitutional reform. The farmers involved weren't revolutionaries trying to destroy America. They were desperate men who'd tried every legal avenue and been ignored, so they tried illegal ones. They weren't wrong about their grievances. The tax system really was crushing them, and their concerns were largely legitimate. They were just wrong about the methods, or at least their methods didn't work. Shays' rebellion demonstrated that the line between civic protest and armed insurrection is thinner than anyone wanted to admit, and that economic policy can become a matter of literal life and death. It showed that veterans who fought for independence wouldn't automatically accept any government policy just because it came from an American government instead of a British one. People who'd made a revolution weren't going to quietly accept conditions they found intolerable just because the flag had changed. The rebellion was a preview of future tensions between creditors and debtors, between federal power and local autonomy, between economic stability and individual hardship. These tensions didn't go away with the new Constitution. They've never really gone away. But at least the Constitutional Convention created a framework for addressing them without resorting to artillery fire in frozen Massachusetts fields. And speaking of constitutional crises, state power, and moments when American democracy came dangerously close to simply not working, let's talk about South Carolina deciding it could just ignore federal laws it didn't like. The 2008 financial crisis. So let's talk about September 2008, when the global financial system came approximately 48 hours away from complete collapse. ATMs nearly stopped working, and the people who supposedly understood finance realized they actually understood nothing. It was like watching someone juggle chainsaws while riding a unicycle, except the chainsaws were the entire world's economy, and the unicycle was on fire. The thing about the 2008 financial crisis is that it didn't start in 2008. It started years earlier, with a housing bubble built on increasingly questionable loans, the kind of financial engineering that makes actual engineers nervous, and a collective delusion that housing prices could only go up forever, which, if you know anything about history or gravity or basic common sense, is obviously false. But somehow very smart people convinced themselves it was true. Here's the simplified version of what happened, though calling it simple is like calling a hurricane a light breeze. Banks started making mortgages to people who couldn't really afford them. These were called subprime mortgages. Subprime being financial jargon for, this person probably can't pay this back, but we're going to pretend they can. The logic was that even if someone couldn't afford their mortgage, housing prices were going up so they could just refinance or sell the house for more than they paid. As long as prices kept rising, everything worked. But banks didn't keep these risky mortgages on their own books. That would be dangerous. Instead, they bundled thousands of mortgages together into something called mortgage-backed securities. Then they sold these securities to investors around the world. The mortgages got sliced and diced and repackaged so many times that nobody really knew what they owned anymore. It was like making a smoothie out of thousands of different fruits, some of which might be rotten, and then selling cups of it to people without telling them what's actually in there. Rating agencies, the organizations supposed to tell investors how risky these securities were, gave them top ratings. A, the safest possible designation, the same rating given to U.S. Treasury bonds. This was insane. These were bundles of mortgages given to people with questionable credit, packaged into complex financial instruments that nobody fully understood, and they were being rated as safe as government bonds. The rating agencies had a conflict of interest, though. They were being paid by the same banks creating these securities, which is like hiring a restaurant critic who gets paid by the restaurants they review. Wall Street loved this system because it was incredibly profitable. Banks could make loans, sell them immediately, and collect fees without bearing the risk. Investment banks packaged the loans and sold them for more fees. Rating agencies charged fees for ratings. Everybody was making money, and the music kept playing, so nobody wanted to be the one to suggest maybe everyone should sit down and think about what they were doing. By 2006, nearly 40% of new mortgages were subprime or otherwise risky. People were getting mortgages with no down payment, no documentation of income, adjustable rates that would balloon after a few years. There were ninja loans, no income, no job, no assets. The assumption was that housing prices would keep rising fast enough that none of this would matter. Except, of course, housing prices didn't keep rising. They couldn't. By mid-2006, housing prices started declining. Suddenly, people who'd bought houses they couldn't afford couldn't refinance because the house was worth less than the mortgage. The adjustable rate mortgages started resetting to higher payments. Foreclosures began to rise. The whole elegant house of cards started to wobble. Financial institutions that had invested heavily in mortgage-backed securities started reporting losses. Bear Stearns, one of the largest investment banks, had 2 hedge funds that collapsed in summer 2007. This should have been a warning sign visible from space. It wasn't treated that way. By early 2008, the problems were getting worse. Bear Stearns itself nearly collapsed in March. The Federal Reserve arranged an emergency sale to J.P. Morgan Chase, which was unusual but seemed to stabilize things. The government and financial industry convinced themselves this was a one-time problem. It wasn't. Through the summer of 2008, more financial institutions got into trouble. Fannie Mae and Fannie Mac, the giant mortgage companies that owned or guaranteed about half of all mortgages in America, were on the verge of collapse. In early September, the government took them over in what was called conservatorship, which is a polite word for these companies failed and now the government owns them. Then came September 15, 2008. Lehman Brothers, one of the oldest and largest investment banks on Wall Street, filed for bankruptcy. It wasn't a small bank. Lehman had been around since 1850. It had $600 billion in assets, and it just collapsed like a building with no foundation. The same day, Merrill Lynch, another giant investment bank, was sold in an emergency sale to Bank of America. 2 of the biggest names in finance, gone in one day. The stock market plummeted. Credit markets froze. Banks stopped trusting each other, which meant they stopped lending to each other, which meant the entire financial system seized up like an engine without oil. The next day, September 16th, American International Group, AIG, one of the world's largest insurance companies, was on the verge of collapse. AIG had sold insurance on all those mortgage-backed securities, promising to pay if the mortgages defaulted. Now mortgages were defaulting everywhere, and AIG didn't have nearly enough money to cover its obligations. The Federal Reserve provided an $85 billion emergency loan to keep AIG alive. This wasn't typical. The Fed doesn't normally bail out insurance companies, but AIG was so interconnected with the global financial system that its collapse would have been catastrophic. By mid-September, the financial system was in full panic. Banks were hoarding cash because they didn't know which other banks might fail. The commercial paper market, where companies get short-term loans to make payroll and buy inventory, essentially stopped functioning. Money market funds, which regular people thought were as safe as savings accounts, were breaking the buck, meaning they were losing value. The Treasury Department had to guarantee money market funds to stop a run. Here's how close it got. On September 18, 2008, Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson and Fed Chairman Ben Bernanke went to Congress for an emergency meeting. They told congressional leaders that, without immediate action, the financial system would collapse within days. Not months. Days. Bernanke reportedly said that without action by the end of the week, we may not have an economy on Monday. ATMs might stop working. Credit cards might not function. The entire payment system could freeze. The Bush administration proposed a $700 billion bailout package called the Troubled Asset Relief Program, TARP. The idea was that the government would buy the toxic mortgage-backed securities from banks, removing them from the financial system. It was the largest government intervention in the economy since the Great Depression, and it was being proposed by a Republican administration that generally opposed government intervention. That's how desperate things were. Congress initially rejected the bailout on September 29. The stock market dropped 778 points in one day. the largest single-day point drop in history at that time. Congressional phone lines were flooded with angry constituents who didn't understand why their tax dollars should rescue Wall Street after Wall Street's recklessness caused the crisis, which was a fair question, actually. The answer was that letting the financial system collapse would hurt everyone, not just Wall Street, but that was a hard sell to people who were rightfully angry. Congress passed a revised version of TARP on October 3rd. The Federal Reserve was taking extraordinary actions. They'd cut interest rates essentially to zero. They'd created emergency lending programs for banks, for money market funds, for commercial paper, for basically every part of the financial system. The Fed was doing things it had never done before because the situation was unprecedented in modern times. Other countries were taking similar emergency actions. The UK partly nationalized its major banks. European governments guaranteed bank deposits. Central banks around the world coordinated to provide dollar liquidity. It was a global crisis requiring global response, and for once, major governments actually coordinated instead of pointing fingers. The immediate panic subsided by late October, but the damage was done. The economy went into deep recession. Unemployment eventually peaked at 10%. Millions of people lost their homes to foreclosure. Trillions of dollars of household wealth evaporated. Small businesses failed because they couldn't get credit. The crisis spread from finance to the real economy, affecting everyone. What saved America and the global financial system during the 2008 crisis was unprecedented government intervention. The Federal Reserve provided trillions in emergency lending. The Treasury Department bought stakes in major banks through TARP, essentially partially nationalizing parts of the financial system. The government guaranteed bank deposits, money market funds, and critical parts of the financial infrastructure. It worked, but barely. The bailouts were deeply unpopular. People were furious that banks got rescued while ordinary homeowners lost their houses. The perception that Wall Street faced no consequences for its recklessness while Main Street suffered created political anger that shaped elections for years afterward. Some bank executives did lose their jobs, and some firms disappeared. But very few people faced criminal prosecution for the fraudulent practices that contributed to the crisis. The response also exposed uncomfortable truths. Some financial institutions were too big to fail, so interconnected and important that their collapse would damage the entire economy. This meant they could take enormous risks knowing the government would rescue them if things went wrong. That's moral hazard, the economic term for when someone takes risks, because someone else will bear the consequences. It's like driving recklessly because you know the airbag will protect you. Congress passed the Dodd-Frank Act in 2010 to regulate the financial industry more strictly. Banks had to hold more capital. There was more oversight of derivatives and complex financial instruments. A new agency was created to protect consumers from predatory lending. The regulations weren't perfect, and many were weakened over subsequent years, but they were an attempt to prevent a repeat crisis. The 2008 financial crisis demonstrated that the global financial system was far more fragile than people realized. It showed that complex financial instruments could spread risk throughout the system in ways nobody fully understood. It revealed that the people running major financial institutions didn't really understand what they were selling or buying. It proved that market discipline and self-regulation couldn't prevent catastrophic failure, but it also showed that government could respond to crisis when it had to. The Federal Reserve and Treasury Department took actions that would have been considered impossible or unacceptable under normal circumstances. They broke the rules because following the rules would have meant economic collapse. Whether those actions were legally questionable or ethically problematic is still debated, but they prevented complete disaster. The lasting impact goes beyond economics. The crisis shook public faith in financial institutions and government, in the idea that experts knew what they were doing. It created political movements on both left and right based on anger at the bailouts. It showed that the system could nearly fail and that realization doesn't go away just because the immediate crisis passes. And speaking of moments when federal authority was directly challenged by states claiming the right to ignore laws they didn't like, let's rewind to the 1830s and talk about South Carolina deciding it could nullify federal tariffs, which almost led to the first state trying to leave the Union. The Nullification Crisis, 1832, 1833. All right, so imagine you're running a country that's still figuring out how federalism works, and one of your states just announces it's going to ignore federal law because it feels like it. Not just complain about the law or lobby to change it, but straight up declare it null and void within state borders. That's the Nullification Crisis, and it was basically a preview of the Civil War, except everyone managed to step back from the edge at the last minute. The crisis centered on tariffs, which sounds boring until you realize tariffs were the most divisive political issue in early America. The federal government needed revenue, and tariffs, taxes on imported goods, were its main source. But tariffs affected different parts of the country very differently. Northern states, which had growing manufacturing industries, loved high tariffs. Tariffs made foreign manufactured goods more expensive, which meant American made products could compete. If British textiles cost more because of tariffs, people would buy American textiles instead. From the northern perspective, tariffs protected American jobs and industry. Southern states, especially South Carolina, hated tariffs. The South's economy was based on agriculture, particularly cotton. Southerners bought manufactured goods, either from the North or from Europe. High tariffs meant manufactured goods cost more, which felt like a direct transfer of wealth from Southern agricultural interests to Northern industrial interests. Southerners bought cotton shirts that cost more because of tariffs designed to help Northern textile mills. They weren't happy about it. In 1828, Congress passed what became known as the Tariff of Abominations. The rates were extremely high, and it was called the Tariff of Abominations because even the people who supported tariffs thought this one was excessive. It passed anyway, largely because of political maneuvering that's too complicated to get into, but basically involved different factions trying to embarrass each other and accidentally creating terrible policy. South Carolina was furious. They saw the tariff as unconstitutional, economically destructive, and proof that the Northern majority would use federal power to benefit themselves at Southern expense. Vice President John C. Calhoun, who was from South Carolina, secretly wrote something called the South Carolina Exposition and Protest, arguing that states had the right to nullify federal laws they considered unconstitutional. Calhoun's theory went like this. The Constitution was a compact among sovereign states. The states created the federal government and delegated certain powers to it. If the federal government exceeded those powers, states could declare the law null and void within their borders. This was called nullification, and it was based on the idea that states were the final judges of constitutionality, not the Supreme Court or federal government. This theory had some problems. For one thing, it's not actually in the Constitution. The Constitution says federal law is the supreme law of the land. It doesn't say states can pick and choose which federal laws apply to them. Also, if every state could nullify any federal law it didn't like, you effectively don't have a federal government. You have a loose association of states that occasionally cooperate when it's convenient, which was basically what the Articles of Confederation had been, and everyone agreed that hadn't worked. But South Carolina wasn't deterred by constitutional objections. They were convinced the tariff was destroying their economy and that the federal government was tyrannical. In 1832, after a new tariff was passed that was lower than the Tariff of Abominations but still higher than South Carolina wanted, the state called a special convention. On November 24th, 1832, South Carolina's convention passed an ordinance of nullification. They declared the federal tariffs of 1828 and 1832 null, void, and not binding on South Carolina. They said no federal official could collect tariff duties in South Carolina after February 1st, 1833, and they added that if the federal government tried to use force to collect the tariff, South Carolina would secede from the Union. This was a direct challenge to federal authority. If South Carolina could nullify a federal law it didn't like, what was to stop other states from nullifying other laws? What would happen to the Union if states could just opt out of federal laws whenever they wanted? President Andrew Jackson was not the kind of person to ignore a direct challenge. Jackson was a former military general who'd fought in the Revolutionary War as a teenager, killed men in duels, and had a personality that can best be described as aggressively confrontational. His response to South Carolina's ordinance was essentially, try it and see what happens. On December 10th, 1832, Jackson issued a proclamation to the people of South Carolina. It was a remarkable document, part constitutional argument, part threat, part appeal to patriotism. Jackson argued that nullification was incompatible with the existence of the Union, that no state could refuse to obey federal law, and that he would use force if necessary to execute federal law. The proclamation's language was uncompromising. Disunion by armed force is treason, Jackson wrote. He pointed out that the Constitution was ratified by the people, not the states, and that federal authority came from the people of the entire nation, not from state governments. He said the idea that states could nullify federal law was incompatible with the existence of the Union, contradicted expressly by the letter of the Constitution, inconsistent with every principle on which it was founded, and destructive of the great object for which it was formed. Jackson also moved military forces into position. He reinforced federal forts in Charleston Harbor. He made clear he would use the military to collect the tariff if South Carolina tried to stop federal officials from doing their jobs. This wasn't an idle threat. Jackson was prepared to invade South Carolina if necessary. South Carolina responded by organizing a military force. They elected regimental officers. They started acquiring weapons. Governor Robert Hayne declared that South Carolina would defend its sovereignty against federal coercion. The state was preparing for armed conflict with the federal government. This was, to put it mildly, a problem. You had a state preparing to fight the federal government over tariff policy. Both sides were mobilizing forces. The situation was escalating rapidly toward violence that could spread to other southern states and potentially destroy the Union. Fortunately, there were people working on compromise. Henry Clay, senator from Kentucky and known as the Great Compromiser for his habit of finding middle ground in political disputes, worked on a tariff bill that would gradually reduce rates over the next decade. The idea was to give South Carolina most of what it wanted economically, while not giving in to the principle of nullification. In late February 1833, Congress passed two significant pieces of legislation. The force bill authorized the president to use military force to ensure federal laws were obeyed and tariffs were collected. It was Jackson's stick. The compromise tariff gradually reduced tariff rates over 10 years. It was Clay's carrot. Jackson signed both bills on March 2nd, 1833. South Carolina backed down. On March 15th, their convention reconvened and repealed the Nullification Ordinance. They declared the tariffs would be enforced in South Carolina. They also, somewhat petulantly, nullified the force bill, but since the crisis was over, nobody cared about that symbolic gesture. What saved America during the Nullification Crisis was a combination of military threat and political compromise. Jackson made absolutely clear that nullification would not be tolerated, that he would use force if necessary to uphold federal authority. This wasn't bluffing. Jackson meant it, and South Carolina knew he meant it. At the same time, Clay's compromise addressed South Carolina's economic grievances, giving them a way to back down while claiming some kind of victory. The crisis was resolved, but the underlying issues weren't. The question of federal versus state authority remained unresolved. South Carolina had backed down, but they demonstrated that a state was willing to defy federal authority, organize military forces, and threaten secession over policy disputes. The principles of states' rights and nullification didn't disappear. They went dormant, waiting for a more serious crisis. Calhoun and other South Carolina leaders knew they'd lost this round, but they saw it as a temporary setback. The real issue from their perspective wasn't tariffs. It was slavery. They feared the federal government might eventually move against slavery the way it had imposed tariffs over Southern objections. The Nullification Crisis was, in many ways, a dress rehearsal for secession, a test of whether a state could successfully defy federal authority. The answer in 1833 was no. Federal authority prevailed, but the question would come up again, and next time, compromise wouldn't work. And speaking of times when the United States literally split apart and fought a war to determine whether it would continue to exist as one nation, well, that brings us to the biggest crisis in American history, the Civil War, 1861-1865. So here we are, the big one, the moment when the United States stopped being united and became temporarily two separate nations trying to kill each other. The Civil War was the closest America ever came to permanent fracture, and the fact that we're still one country is honestly more surprising than it might seem when you consider that over 600,000 people died fighting over whether we should be. Let's be clear about what caused this war, because there's been a lot of historical revisionism suggesting it was about states' rights or economic differences or cultural disagreements. It was about slavery. Full stop. You can read the declarations of secession from the Confederate States, and they explicitly say they're leaving because of slavery. Mississippi's declaration states, "Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world." South Carolina's declaration complains about northern states not returning escaped slaves. It's not subtle. The immediate trigger was the election of Abraham Lincoln in November 1860. Lincoln was the first Republican president, and the Republican Party had been founded specifically to oppose the expansion of slavery into new territories. Lincoln wasn't an abolitionist in 1860. He didn't campaign on ending slavery where it already existed, just on preventing its spread. But Southern states didn't trust him. They saw the writing on the wall. The North had more people, more industry, and was growing faster. Eventually, the North would have enough political power to end slavery everywhere, and Southern states weren't willing to wait for that to happen. South Carolina seceded on December 20th, 1860, before Lincoln even took office. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, and Louisiana followed in January 1861. Texas seceded in February. These 7 states formed the Confederate States of America on February 4th, 1861, in Montgomery, Alabama. They wrote their own constitution, which was remarkably similar to the U.S. Constitution, except it explicitly protected slavery and, ironically, limited the power of the Confederate federal government to interfere with state laws regarding slavery. Jefferson Davis became president of the Confederacy. He was a former U.S. Senator from Mississippi, a West Point graduate, and a veteran of the Mexican-American War. The Confederacy established its capital in Richmond, Virginia, about 100 miles from Washington, D.C., which meant the two national capitals would be uncomfortably close to each other for the next 4 years. Lincoln took office on March 4th, 1861, inheriting a country that was falling apart. In his inaugural address, he made clear he had no intention of interfering with slavery where it existed, but also that he considered secession illegal and would preserve the Union. In your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war, he said, which was diplomatic but firm. You started this and you can end it by coming back. The Confederacy wasn't interested in coming back. They'd already seized federal forts, arsenals, and customs houses in their states. The major exception was Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, which remained under federal control with a small Union garrison commanded by Major Robert Anderson. Fort Sumter became the focal point. Lincoln faced a dilemma. If he reinforced or resupplied the fort, the Confederacy would see it as an act of war. If he abandoned it, he'd be acknowledging Confederate authority and encouraging more states to secede. He chose a middle path, announcing he would resupply the fort with food and supplies, but not weapons or troops. The Confederacy decided this was unacceptable. On April 12, 1861, Confederate forces under General P.G.T. Beauregard began bombarding Fort Sumter. The fort's garrison returned fire but was hopelessly outgunned. After 34 hours of bombardment, Anderson surrendered. Remarkably, nobody on either side was killed during the actual battle, though one Union soldier died during the surrender ceremony when a cannon exploded. But the war had started. Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to put down the rebellion. This prompted 4 more states, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina, to secede and join the Confederacy. Virginia's secession was particularly significant because it was the most populous southern state and had considerable industrial capacity. The Confederacy moved its capital to Richmond. The Union strategy, developed by General Winfield Scott, was called the Anaconda Plan. The idea was to blockade southern ports, cutting off the Confederacy's ability to export cotton and import weapons and supplies. Then Union forces would control the Mississippi River, splitting the Confederacy in half. Finally, they'd squeeze from all sides until the Confederacy collapsed. It was a sound strategy, but it would take years to implement. The Confederacy's strategy was essentially defensive. They didn't need to conquer the North. They just needed to make the war so costly that the North would give up and recognize Confederate independence. If they could win enough battles, inflict enough casualties, and hold out long enough, Northern public opinion might turn against the war and force Lincoln to negotiate. The first major battle was at Bull Run in Virginia on July 21st, 1861. Both armies were poorly trained and poorly organized. The battle was chaotic. The Union Army advanced confidently, expecting to crush the rebels and end the war quickly. Instead, Confederate forces under General Thomas Jackson held a critical position. Someone said Jackson was standing like a stone wall, giving him the nickname Stonewall Jackson. Confederate reinforcements arrived by railroad, the first time trains had been used strategically in war. The Union Army broke and retreated in disorder back to Washington. Bull Run shattered the illusion that the war would be quick or easy. Both sides realized they were in for a long, brutal conflict. The Union began organizing larger armies. The Confederacy knew they'd have to fight a defensive war against superior numbers and resources. The war's scope expanded rapidly. Naval blockades, major battles in Virginia and Tennessee, fighting along the Mississippi River. The Union captured New Orleans in April 1862, a major blow to the Confederacy. There were massive battles at Shiloh, where over 23,000 casualties in 2 days shocked both sides. The Battle of Antietam in September 1862 was the bloodiest single day in American history, with over 22,000 casualties. The battlefield was described as carpeted with bodies. Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863. It declared that all slaves in Confederate-held territory were free. It didn't free slaves in border states that had remained in the Union, which was legally and politically complicated, but it fundamentally changed the war's nature. Now, the Union wasn't just fighting to preserve the Union, it was fighting to end slavery. This made foreign intervention on behalf of the Confederacy much less likely. Britain and France had both been considering recognizing the Confederacy, but neither wanted to support a nation fighting to preserve slavery after Lincoln made emancipation a war aim. The Battle of Gettysburg in July 1863 was the war's turning point in the Eastern Theater. General Robert E. Lee invaded Pennsylvania, hoping a victory on Northern soil would break Union morale and possibly lead to peace negotiations. The battle lasted 3 days. On the third day, Lee ordered what became known as Pickett's Charge, a massive frontal assault across open fields against entrenched Union positions. It was slaughter. Half of the attacking force was killed, wounded, or captured. Lee retreated to Virginia and would never again have the strength to invade the North. The same week as Gettysburg, Vicksburg on the Mississippi River fell to Union forces under General Ulysses S. Grant after a long siege. This gave the Union control of the Mississippi, splitting the Confederacy in two. Confederate states west of the river were cut off from the rest of the Confederacy. Grant became the Union's most successful general. His strategy was brutal but effective, constant pressure, attacking even after defeats, grinding down Confederate forces through superior numbers and resources. In March 1864, Lincoln made Grant commander of all Union armies. Grant coordinated simultaneous offensives on multiple fronts, preventing Confederate forces from shifting troops to meet different threats. The Overland Campaign in spring 1864 saw Grant's army fighting Lee's army in a series of bloody battles in Virginia. The Wilderness, Spotsylvania Courthouse, Cold Harbor. The casualties were horrific. At Cold Harbor, Union forces suffered 7,000 casualties in less than an hour attacking entrenched Confederate positions, but Grant kept moving south toward Richmond, forcing Lee to defend the Confederate capital. Meanwhile, General William Tecumseh Sherman captured Atlanta in September 1864, a crucial victory that helped Lincoln win re-election. Sherman then marched his army from Atlanta to Savannah, destroying everything of military value along a 60-mile wide path. His march to the sea demonstrated that the Confederacy couldn't protect its own territory. Sherman's army then turned north through the Carolinas, heading toward Virginia to link up with Grant. By early 1865, the Confederacy was collapsing. Lee's army was trapped at Petersburg, defending Richmond. Confederate forces were deserting in large numbers. The Southern economy had been destroyed by the blockade and Union armies. There was no money, no food, no hope. On April 2, 1865, Lee's army abandoned Petersburg and Richmond. The Confederate government fled. On April 9th, Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. Grant's terms were generous. Confederate soldiers could go home and wouldn't be prosecuted for treason as long as they obeyed U.S. law. Officers could keep their sidearms, and any soldier who owned a horse could keep it for spring planting. Grant wanted to make peace, not humiliate the defeated. Other Confederate armies surrendered over the following weeks. Jefferson Davis was captured in Georgia in May. The war was over. The Union had been preserved. Slavery was ending. The 13th Amendment abolishing slavery throughout the United States was ratified in December 1865. What saved America during the Civil War was ultimately the Union's willingness to pay an enormous cost to preserve the nation. Over 360,000 Union soldiers died, about 110,000 in battle, and the rest from disease and other causes. The Confederacy lost over 250,000 soldiers. Hundreds of thousands more were wounded or maimed. Entire cities were destroyed. The economic cost was staggering, but the Union won because it had more people, more industry, more railroads, more of almost everything needed to wage modern war. The Union Navy blockaded southern ports effectively. Union armies used railroads and telegraphs to coordinate operations. Northern factories produced weapons and supplies. Immigration continued during the war, providing more manpower. The Confederacy fought well with inferior resources, but ultimately couldn't overcome the Union's advantages. Confederate hopes that Britain or France would intervene never materialized. The idea that one or two major victories would break Northern morale proved wrong. The Confederacy needed the North to give up. The North didn't give up. Lincoln's leadership was crucial. He made mistakes, but he learned from them. He found generals who would fight aggressively. He articulated war aims that gave moral purpose to the struggle. His re-election in 1864, despite the war's enormous cost, showed that Northern voters were committed to seeing it through. The Civil War proved that the United States was, in fact, one nation that couldn't be divided, but it left deep scars and unresolved questions about race, federal power, and regional identity that echo through American history to this day. And speaking of deep scars and unresolved questions, the period immediately after the Civil War was when America had a chance to truly remake itself into a more just society, and then largely failed to do so in ways that shaped the next century. Reconstruction's collapse, 1877. So the Civil War ended in April 1865, which meant America now faced the slightly awkward question of what to do with the 11 states that had just spent 4 years trying to leave. The period called Reconstruction was supposed to be about rebuilding the South, integrating formerly enslaved people into American society as citizens with rights, and figuring out how the Union and former Confederacy would coexist. It started with real promise and ended in complete failure. And that failure shaped American racial politics for the next century. This is the story of how America almost became a genuinely multiracial democracy in the 1870s, and then decided not to, with consequences we're still dealing with. The challenge was unprecedented. 4 million formerly enslaved people were suddenly free, which was obviously good, but they had no land, no money, no education, and no legal protections in states where most white people didn't want them to have rights. Meanwhile, former Confederate states needed to be readmitted to the Union, but under what conditions? Could former Confederate leaders hold office? Would the South accept black civil rights? These weren't minor administrative questions. They were fundamental issues about what kind of country America would be. Lincoln had favored a relatively lenient approach to Reconstruction. His plan allowed Southern states to rejoin the Union when 10% of voters took an oath of loyalty and accepted emancipation. He wanted to restore the Union quickly without being punitive. But Lincoln was assassinated on April 14th, 1865, 5 days after Lee's surrender. He never got to implement his Reconstruction vision. Vice President Andrew Johnson became president. Johnson was a Democrat from Tennessee, the only Southern senator who didn't resign when his state seceded. He seemed like a good choice for handling Reconstruction, a Southern Unionist who opposed secession. But Johnson also held deeply racist views and believed Reconstruction should be quick and easy on former Confederates. Johnson's Reconstruction plan let Southern states back in with minimal requirements. Former Confederate leaders quickly regained power. Southern states passed black codes, laws that restricted the rights of formerly enslaved people in ways that closely resembled slavery. Black people couldn't vote, couldn't serve on juries, couldn't own firearms, had to sign yearly labor contracts, and could be arrested for vagrancy and essentially forced back into plantation labor. The black codes were slavery by another name. This enraged congressional Republicans who thought they'd fought a war to end slavery, not create a slightly different version of it. In 1866, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act, declaring that all persons born in the United States were citizens with equal rights regardless of race. Johnson vetoed it. Congress overrode his veto. The first time in American history a major piece of legislation became law over a presidential veto. The 14th Amendment was ratified in 1868. guaranteeing citizenship and equal protection under law to all people born in the United States. This was huge. It constitutionalized the principle that Black Americans were citizens with rights. Southern states initially refused to ratify it, so Congress made ratification a condition for readmission to the Union. Congressional Reconstruction, also called Radical Reconstruction, began in earnest in 1867. Congress divided the South into military districts governed by Army generals. Southern states had to write new constitutions guaranteeing Black voting rights, ratify the 14th Amendment, and hold elections where Black men could vote. Only then could they rejoin the Union. This actually worked for a while. Black men voted in large numbers. Black politicians were elected to state legislatures, to Congress, to local offices. During Reconstruction, 16 Black men served in Congress, including 2 senators. Dozens more served in state governments. This represented genuine political power for formerly enslaved people. Barely a decade after emancipation, Reconstruction governments, often coalitions of Black voters, white Southerners who supported the Union, and Northern transplants called carpetbaggers, established public schools, rebuilt an infrastructure destroyed by the war, and passed progressive legislation. They weren't perfect governments. There was corruption, though probably no more than in northern states at the time. But they represented a radical experiment in multiracial democracy. White Southerners who opposed Reconstruction used violence to undermine it. The Ku Klux Klan formed in 1865 in Tennessee and spread across the South. The Klan and similar groups used terrorism, whipping, torture, murder to prevent Black people from voting and to intimidate white Republicans. They assassinated Republican politicians and leaders of Black communities. The violence was systematic and widespread. The federal government tried to combat this terrorism. The Enforcement Acts of 1870 and 1871 made it federal crimes to interfere with voting rights or to conspire to deprive people of civil rights. The Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871 allowed the president to suspend habeas corpus and use military force against the Klan. President Grant actually did this in parts of South Carolina, deploying federal troops and arresting hundreds of Klan members. For a few years, federal intervention suppressed the violence somewhat, but Northern support for Reconstruction gradually eroded. The war had ended over a decade ago. People were tired of military occupation of the South. There was a financial panic in 1873 that created a depression, and voters cared more about economic issues than about protecting Black civil rights in the South. Also, many Northerners were themselves racist and didn't actually support genuine racial equality. They'd supported ending slavery and preserving the Union. But full civil rights for Black Americans was a different question. The presidential election of 1876 created a crisis that ended Reconstruction. The election between Republican Rutherford Hayes and Democrat Samuel Tilden was extremely close and disputed. Several Southern states submitted competing sets of electoral votes. Nobody was certain who'd actually won. The result hung on electoral votes from Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina, the last 3 Southern states with Reconstruction governments still in place. Congress established a special electoral commission to resolve the dispute. The commission, along party lines, awarded all disputed votes to Hayes, giving him the presidency by 1 electoral vote. Democrats were furious and threatened not to accept the result. Behind the scenes, there was a deal. The exact details are disputed because it was never put in writing, but the basic agreement was this: Democrats would accept Hayes as president. In return, Hayes would withdraw federal troops from the South, ending military support for Reconstruction governments. The Compromise of 1877, as it became known, effectively ended Reconstruction. Hayes took office on March 4th, 1877. By the end of April, He'd withdrawn federal troops from Louisiana and South Carolina. The Reconstruction governments collapsed immediately without military protection. Democrats who opposed Reconstruction took power throughout the South. What followed was systematic disenfranchisement of black voters through poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, and outright violence. Jim Crow, segregation was established throughout the South. Black Americans were legally segregated, economically oppressed, and politically powerless. This would last for nearly a century until the civil rights movement of the 1960s. The collapse of Reconstruction was a catastrophic failure of American democracy. For about a decade, there was genuine possibility of creating a multiracial society where formerly enslaved people had real civil rights and political power. Then the North gave up, withdrew support, and abandoned black Southerners to violence and oppression. What saved America during Reconstruction's collapse is a complicated question because, in many ways, America wasn't saved. A negotiated political compromise avoided renewed civil war between North and South. The disputed election was resolved through politics rather than violence. The Union remained intact. In that narrow sense, the nation survived, but millions of black Americans were condemned to generations of oppression. The promise of the Civil War amendments, citizenship, equal protection, voting rights, was betrayed. The South developed a segregated society that denied basic rights to a large portion of its population. This created deep inequities and injustices that persist today. The Compromise of 1877 stabilized the nation by sacrificing the civil rights of black Americans. It was a political solution that avoided immediate crisis by creating a longer-term moral catastrophe. Whether that counts as saving America depends on whose America you're talking about. It saved the Union as a political entity. It failed millions of Americans as human beings deserving of rights and dignity. The collapse of Reconstruction demonstrated that fighting a war to end slavery wasn't enough. Actually, creating a just society required sustained commitment, federal enforcement, and willingness to confront violent resistance. When that commitment failed, so did Reconstruction. And speaking of moments when the constitutional order was tested during wartime, let's talk about what happened when a president died suddenly while leading the nation through a global conflict. World War II transition of power, 1944-1945. Let's talk about April 1945, when Franklin Delano Roosevelt died suddenly in the middle of leading America through the largest war in human history, and the entire free world collectively held its breath, wondering if the democratic transfer of power could actually work during an existential crisis. Spoiler, it did, but the fact that it was even a question tells you something about how precarious the moment was. Roosevelt had been president for over 12 years by April 1945. 12 years. He'd been elected 4 times, which nobody had done before or has done since because we added a constitutional amendment after FDR specifically to prevent it from happening again. An entire generation of Americans had never known another president. People in their 20s had been children when Roosevelt took office during the Great Depression. He was the only president they remembered. And Roosevelt wasn't just any wartime leader. He'd guided America through the Depression with a New Deal, rebuilt public confidence in democracy when fascism and communism seemed like viable alternatives, navigated the delicate politics of staying neutral while helping Britain survive, and then led the country through World War II after Pearl Harbor. He'd met with Churchill and Stalin at conferences that shaped the post-war world. He was personally involved in military strategy, diplomatic negotiations, and the Manhattan Project to build the atomic bomb. He knew everything, and he was the glue holding the Allied coalition together. Except by early 1945, Roosevelt was dying, and almost nobody knew it. He'd been sick for years. His blood pressure was dangerously high. He had congestive heart failure, he'd lost weight, had difficulty concentrating, and experienced severe headaches. His personal physician, Admiral Ross McIntyre, kept telling everyone Roosevelt was fine, which was either incompetent or deliberately deceptive, probably both. Roosevelt looked terrible in photos and newsreels from 1944 and 45. People who saw him in person were shocked by his appearance. The election of 1944 happened while Roosevelt was clearly in declining health. The Democratic Party, aware that Roosevelt might not survive a fourth term, carefully chose his vice president. The previous vice president, Henry Wallace, was too liberal for party bosses. They wanted someone more moderate, someone who could work with Congress. They settled on Harry S. Truman, a senator from Missouri. Truman wasn't particularly well known nationally. He'd gained some prominence as chairman of a Senate committee investigating waste and corruption in defense spending, but he wasn't a major figure. He'd been a farmer, a haberdasher whose store failed, a county judge in Missouri. He had a high school education, he wore thick glasses. He was nobody's idea of presidential material, which is probably why the party bosses liked him. He seemed controllable. Roosevelt and Truman won the election in November 1944. Roosevelt took the oath of office for his fourth term on January 20th, 1945. The inauguration was subdued, held at the White House instead of the Capitol because Roosevelt claimed wartime austerity required it, but really because he didn't have the strength for an elaborate ceremony. Truman became vice president, and Roosevelt basically ignored him. They met privately only twice after the inauguration. Roosevelt didn't brief Truman on major issues. Truman didn't know about the Manhattan Project. He didn't know about secret negotiations with the Soviets. He wasn't included in high-level military planning. He attended cabinet meetings and presided over the Senate, but he wasn't in the loop on anything important. This was partially Roosevelt's style. He kept information compartmentalized and didn't share much with anyone. But it was also arrogance or short-sightedness. Roosevelt seemed to think he'd serve out his fourth term, or maybe he couldn't face the reality of his own mortality. Either way, he left his vice president completely unprepared to assume the presidency. On March 30th, 1945, Roosevelt traveled to Warm Springs, Georgia, where he often went for rest and therapy for his polio. He was exhausted from the Yalta Conference with Churchill and Stalin in February, where they'd negotiated the post-war occupation of Germany and other issues. Roosevelt needed a break. On the afternoon of April 12th, Roosevelt was sitting for a portrait in his cottage at Warm Springs. He was chatting with friends, signing documents, doing paperwork. Around 1 p.m., he raised his hand to his head and said, "I have a terrific pain in the back of my head." Then he slumped forward, unconscious. He'd suffered a massive cerebral hemorrhage. Doctors were called. There was nothing they could do. Franklin Delano Roosevelt died at 3:35 p.m. Eastern Wartime. He was 63 years old. The president who'd led America through the Depression and most of World War II was gone. Less than a month before Germany surrendered and 4 months before Japan did. News of Roosevelt's death stunned the nation and the world. People wept openly in the streets. Radio stations played funeral music. The stock market closed early. In Washington, government workers left their offices in silence. Soldiers in Europe and the Pacific received the news with disbelief. How could Roosevelt be dead? He'd always been there. Foreign leaders reacted with shock. Churchill wept when he heard. Stalin expressed condolences. Even Hitler in his bunker in Berlin, as Soviet forces closed in, reportedly took grim satisfaction that his great enemy wouldn't live to see Germany's defeat, though Germany had only weeks left anyway. Harry Truman was in the Capitol when Roosevelt died. He'd been presiding over the Senate and then stopped by House Speaker Sam Rayburn's office for a drink. as he often did at the end of the day. Rayburn told him to call the White House. When Truman called, Eleanor Roosevelt's press secretary answered and told him to come immediately. Truman arrived at the White House around 5:25 p.m. Eleanor Roosevelt met him and said, "Harry, the president is dead." Truman asked if there was anything he could do for her. Eleanor replied, "Is there anything we can do for you? For you are the one in trouble now." That was an understatement. Truman was about to become President of the United States during the final stages of the largest war in history, and he knew almost nothing about what was happening. He hadn't been briefed on military operations, diplomatic negotiations, or secret projects. He was walking into the most powerful office in the world completely unprepared. At 7:09 p.m. in the cabinet room at the White House, Harry Truman took the oath of office as the 33rd president. Chief Justice Harlan Stone administered the oath. Cabinet members, congressional leaders, and Truman's wife and daughter attended. The ceremony lasted less than a minute. Truman placed his hand on a Bible, repeated the oath, and suddenly he was president. The first cabinet meeting as Truman's presidency happened immediately after the swearing-in. Secretary of War Henry Stimson stayed after the others left and told Truman about the Manhattan Project. Stimson said the United States was developing a new explosive of almost unbelievable destructive power. That was Truman's introduction to the atomic bomb, a brief conversation the day he became president about a weapon that would change human history. The transition was remarkably smooth given the circumstances. Truman kept Roosevelt's cabinet initially. He continued Roosevelt's policies. Military operations proceeded without interruption. The planned offensives in Europe and the Pacific continued. Allied leaders expressed support for the new president, even though most of them had never met him. But there were enormous challenges. The war in Europe was nearly over. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, less than a month after Truman took office. But the war in the Pacific continued. Military planners were predicting that invading Japan would cost hundreds of thousands of American casualties. Truman would have to make decisions about how to end that war. Then there was the Soviet Union. Roosevelt had tried to maintain good relations with Stalin, believing post-war cooperation was possible. Truman was more skeptical. At the Potsdam Conference in July 1945, Truman met Stalin and Churchill for the first time as president. The meeting dealt with the occupation of Germany, reparations, and the post-war order in Europe. Truman was learning on the job, negotiating with experienced leaders who'd been at this for years. On July 16, 1945, while Truman was at Potsdam, the United States successfully tested the first atomic bomb at Alamogordo, New Mexico. Truman received a coded message about the test's success. He now had to decide whether to use the bomb against Japan. The decision to drop atomic bombs on Hiroshima on August 6th and Nagasaki on August 9th remains controversial. Truman authorized the attacks, believing they would end the war quickly and save American lives by avoiding an invasion of Japan. Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945. Whether the atomic bombs were necessary, whether Japan would have surrendered without them, whether the devastation was justified, these are questions still debated. But from the perspective of governmental stability, the transition from Roosevelt to Truman worked. The United States didn't collapse into political chaos when its longtime leader died. The military continued functioning. Allied relationships remained intact. The war was won. The constitutional process of secession operated as designed even under the most stressful circumstances imaginable. What saved America during this transition was institutional stability. The Constitution provided clear rules for presidential succession. The cabinet and military leadership continued their work. Congress functioned normally. There was no crisis of legitimacy, no question about who was in charge. Truman was president because the Constitution said so, and everyone accepted it. It helped that Truman, despite being unprepared, rose to the challenge. He made difficult decisions quickly. He surrounded himself with capable advisors. He was humble enough to admit what he didn't know and smart enough to learn fast. He wasn't Roosevelt, but he was competent, and competence was enough. The smooth transition demonstrated American democracy's resilience. Other countries experiencing leadership transitions during crises often faced coups, civil wars, or governmental collapse. The United States had a constitutional process and followed it. The vice president became president. Life went on. It seems almost boring when described that way, but boring's exactly what you want during a constitutional crisis. The experience did lead to changes. The 25th Amendment, ratified in 1967, clarified presidential succession and disability procedures. It established formal processes for the vice president to assume presidential powers if the president is incapacitated. These rules might have helped in 1945 if Roosevelt had been willing to admit he was dying, but at least they exist now for future crises. Roosevelt's death during World War II was a test of whether democracy could survive the sudden loss of leadership during existential crisis. America passed that test, not through dramatic heroics, but through boring constitutional procedure working as designed. And speaking of constitutional procedures being tested by presidential behavior, let's talk about the time a president's involvement in criminal activities threatened to destroy public faith in democracy itself. The Watergate Crisis, 1973-1974. So imagine you're an American in June 1972, reading the newspaper, and you see a small article about a break-in at the Democratic National Committee, headquarters in the Watergate office complex in Washington, D.C. 5 men were arrested trying to bug the phones. Weird, you think, and then you probably turned the page and forgot about it. Nobody imagined that this third-rate burglary would lead to a constitutional crisis, televised hearings watched by millions, the first presidential resignation in American history, and a suffix that would be attached to every political scandal for the next 50 years. The break-in happened on June 17, 1972. 5 men were caught inside the DNC offices at the Watergate complex. They had cameras, bugging equipment, and sequentially numbered $100 bills. One of them, James McCord, was the security coordinator for the committee to re-elect the president, Richard Nixon's re-election campaign, which had the unfortunate acronym CREEP. The initial reaction from the Nixon White House was to dismiss it as a minor incident. Ron Ziegler, Nixon's press secretary, called it a third-rate burglary attempt. The implication was that this had nothing to do with the president or his campaign, just some overzealous operatives doing something stupid without authorization. Except it wasn't a minor incident, and it absolutely involved the White House. The burglars had connections to Nixon's campaign and to people in the administration. Money paid to the burglars came from Nixon campaign funds, and the White House immediately began covering up the connections. Nixon won re-election in November 1972 in a landslide, carrying 49 states against Democratic candidate George McGovern. The Watergate story hadn't gained much traction. Most Americans either hadn't heard about it or didn't care. Nixon was at the height of his power, having negotiated the opening to China, détente with the Soviet Union, and a peace agreement to end American involvement in Vietnam. But 2 reporters at the Washington Post, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, kept investigating. They had a source inside the government, famously codenamed Deep Throat, who provided information about White House involvement in the break-in and cover-up. Deep Throat's identity remained secret until 2005, when he was revealed to be Mark Felt, the FBI's deputy director during Watergate. The story gradually expanded. It wasn't just about the break-in. It was about a pattern of illegal activities by the Nixon administration, political espionage, sabotage of opponents, misuse of government agencies like the FBI and CIA for political purposes, illegal campaign contributions, and obstruction of justice to cover it all up. In February 1973, the Senate established the Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities, chaired by Sam Ervin of North Carolina. The Ervin Committee's televised hearings ran from May to August 1973 and became appointment television for millions of Americans. People watched senators question witnesses about what the president knew and when he knew it. The hearings revealed stunning information. John Dean, Nixon's White House counsel, testified that Nixon was directly involved in the cover-up. Dean described a cancer on the presidency and detailed efforts to pay hush money to the burglars, obstruct the FBI investigation, and use the CIA to block the investigation. Dean had been a loyal member of the team until Nixon essentially offered him up as a scapegoat, at which point Dean decided to cooperate with investigators. Then came the bombshell. Alexander Butterfield, a former White House aide, revealed that Nixon had a taping system in the Oval Office. Every conversation in the Oval Office and several other locations had been recorded since February 1971. Suddenly, there was potential proof of what Nixon knew and when. The tapes became the central issue. The Senate committee wanted them. The special prosecutor, Archibald Cox, subpoenaed them. Nixon refused, claiming executive privilege, the principle that presidents can keep some communications confidential to protect candidate advice and national security. The legal battle over the tapes escalated. In October 1973, Nixon ordered Attorney General Elliot Richardson to fire Cox. Richardson refused and resigned. Nixon then ordered Deputy Attorney General William Ruckelshaus to fire Cox. Ruckelshaus refused and resigned. Finally, Solicitor General Robert Bork, third in line at the Justice Department, carried out Nixon's order and fired Cox. This became known as the Saturday Night Massacre, and it was a public relations disaster for Nixon. The public reaction was intense. Congressional offices were flooded with telegrams and phone calls demanding Nixon's impeachment. The House Judiciary Committee began formal impeachment proceedings. Nixon appointed a new special prosecutor, Leon Jaworski, who continued pursuing the tapes. The legal battle went to the Supreme Court. In United States versus Nixon, decided in July 1974, the court ruled unanimously that executive privilege couldn't be used to withhold evidence in a criminal investigation. Nixon had to turn over the tapes. The tapes were devastating. They revealed Nixon discussing the cover-up, suggesting ways to obstruct the FBI investigation, and approving payments to the burglars. One tape had an 18.5-minute gap that appeared to be deliberate erasure, though it was never proven who erased it or what was said. The most damaging tape was from June 23, 1972, 6 days after the break-in. It showed Nixon and his chief of staff, H.R. Haldeman, discussing using the CIA to stop the FBI's investigation. This was clear evidence of obstruction of justice and became known as the smoking gun tape. By late July 1974, the House Judiciary Committee had approved 3 articles of impeachment against Nixon: obstruction of justice, abuse of power, and contempt of Congress. The full House was expected to approve impeachment, and the Senate would then hold a trial. Republican leaders told Nixon he had no more than 15 supporters in the Senate. Conviction was certain. Nixon faced a choice. He could fight impeachment, go through a Senate trial, and be removed from office in disgrace. Or he could resign. On August 8, 1974, he chose resignation. In a televised address, Nixon announced he would resign the presidency effective at noon the next day. He never admitted wrongdoing, claiming his decision was based on lack of political support, not guilt. On August 9, 1974, at 9:02 a.m., Richard Nixon departed the White House for the last time as president. He gave an emotional, rambling speech to his staff, talking about his mother, his father, and how people who hate you don't win unless you hate them back. He and his wife, Pat, then walked to Marine One, where Nixon turned, raised his arms in a final V for victory gesture, and flew away. At noon that day, Gerald Ford was sworn in as the 38th president. Ford hadn't been elected president or vice president. He'd been appointed vice president in December 1973 after Spiro Agnew resigned due to his own corruption charges. Now he was president, and his first words were, "Our long national nightmare is over. What saved America during the Watergate crisis was the constitutional system functioning despite resistance." The courts ordered Nixon to produce evidence. Congress investigated thoroughly. The press exposed wrongdoing. When the evidence became overwhelming, Republican leaders told Nixon he'd be removed from office, and he resigned rather than face that humiliation. Critically, Nixon resigned instead of defying the Supreme Court or refusing to leave office. He could have tried to rally his supporters, claimed the investigation was illegitimate, or refused to accept the constitutional process. He didn't. When it became clear he'd lost, he left. That sounds simple, but it required accepting that the rule of law applied to the president. The crisis revealed that the system had worked, but barely. If Nixon had destroyed the tapes, there might not have been enough evidence to force him from office. If Republican senators had been willing to support him regardless of evidence, impeachment might have failed. If the Supreme Court hadn't ruled unanimously, Nixon might have defied a divided court. The outcome depended on institutional integrity and individuals choosing country over party. Watergate led to reforms. Campaign finance laws were strengthened. The independent counsel statute was created to investigate executive branch wrongdoing. The Freedom of Information Act was strengthened to increase government transparency. These reforms were attempts to prevent future abuses with mixed success. The lasting impact of Watergate goes beyond specific reforms. It shattered public faith in government and in presidents particularly. Before Watergate, Americans generally trusted that presidents told the truth. After Watergate, skepticism became the default. It demonstrated that presidents could be involved in serious crimes and would lie about them. It showed that trusting institutions to check presidential power was necessary because presidents wouldn't voluntarily restrain themselves. Nixon's resignation proved that no one is above the law, not even the president. But it also showed how close that principle came to failing. The system worked, but it was tested to its limits, and the fact that it survived doesn't mean it will always survive similar tests. Democracy requires not just good institutions, but people willing to use those institutions to uphold the law even when it's politically difficult. And there you have it. 10 times America nearly stopped being America, and 10 times we somehow stumbled through to the next crisis. The thing about all these near collapses is that they weren't solved by superheroes or perfect leaders or divine intervention. They were solved by imperfect people making difficult compromises, sometimes getting things right, sometimes just buying enough time to fix problems later. The constitutional system bent far enough that it didn't break. People chose negotiation over violence just often enough to matter. Institutions held together through combination of good design and sheer stubbornness. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep, you can rest easy knowing that America has survived economic apocalypse, nuclear brinksmanship, civil war, and presidents recording their own crimes. We've made it through worse than whatever's happening now. Probably. Sweet dreams. And remember, somewhere out there, someone is making a decision that future historians will describe as the moment when everything nearly fell apart, but didn't. Let's hope they're as lucky as the people we talked about tonight. Sleep well.